Welcome back to the shop, guys. Let's talk about two-cycle oil. What type you should run, what brands, how much you should run. Are you just following the manufacturer recommendations around like 50 or 60 or 1 or 32 or 1? What if I told you the proper ratio is a combination of rider conditions and engine size? Let's dig in. On a two-stroke engine, the motor oil that you put right in here, that is actually transmission oil, I guess you can call it. Really all it's lubing is the clutches and the transmission. But the actual crankshaft, the piston, and the cylinder is lubed by the premix, the oil that you put into your gasoline. The intake charge coming from the carburetor, it will draw the air fuel mixture into the crank area first, and when the piston is on its way down, it compresses that charge. When the piston goes down far enough that it exposes the transfer ports, that charge goes up into the combustion chamber to where the piston then goes back up, compresses it, and fires it. And the reed valves here, they're just a one-way valve, so they do allow the charge to go in here but not back, and that's what allows the piston to compress it on its way down. But that's where your crank is getting its lubrication from, is the actual oil and the gas, and as well as your piston. That's the only place that it's getting its lubrication from. Let me see if I can bring another bike in here that's opened up, and I'll give you a better view. This poor old KX65 has seen its better days, but I have this motor open here, so I'll show you. You can see the crankshaft down here. You can see it spinning the rod. I'm just running through this for you guys that don't really know the innards of these motors. It'll only take a second, guys, and we'll get to the good stuff, so stick around. And there's your piston. And here's a cylinder for it. This is what you call a cylinder redesign, where the reeds are on the actual cylinder. But you'll see that this path right here goes down into this area and into that area. Basically, when you put this on the bike, set on like that, these two areas right here are sending the intake charge into the crank area. You'll see it has a nice little ramp letting it go in there. So it first goes into here, your air and your fuel. First goes into the crank area, and again, as the piston goes down, it compresses that charge that's in there, and it can't escape because of the reed pedals here are a one-way valve. So it can't escape, it gets pressurized. When this gets far enough down where it relieves the transfer ports inside this piston, let me get a bigger cylinder here so you can see it better. There you go, big old boy. Alright, you can see these are the transfer ports. Piston's up, cylinder's upside down right now. But when the piston comes down far enough, here, let's look at it from this way, where it goes down far enough where it exposes the transfer ports to the combustion chamber, that charge, it jumps up into here, and then the piston comes back up and compresses it and fires. But the point that I'm trying to get across is that is what lubes your crank and your piston. That's why I'm explaining all that to you. Let me take a second to remove this piston off this rod. We'll get a better view. So you would think that when the air and the fuel comes into here, and then it goes up in the top end, it just burns oil and the oil's gone forever. But that happens to not be the case. If there's a such thing what they call migrating oil. That's oil that hangs around in the crank area for a while before it finally, I guess, gets thinned out enough or whatever, and eventually makes it to the top end to be consumed and burnt. And that's why you get smoke out of the tail end of your smoker. When the fuel is atomized, when it's come from the carburetor through the reed valves and into the crank area here, it's atomized, which means it's turning from a liquid into a vapor or a gas. When it makes that transition, it drops the oil out of suspension of the gas. It literally drops the oil, and that's why you have the buildup of migration in the crank area, which eventually spits it up to the top end. But if you're running the proper oil amount, when you go to do a top end, you should be able to spin your crank like this real fast. Did you see that oil? Watch right over here. You'll see some oil start sticking on the crank. You see that oil coming up, rising with the crank as I'm spinning it? That's migrating oil. There's a puddle of oil down in the bottom of the crank. The crank's sitting there, and there's just a little puddle down at the bottom. And you should have that. If you spin your crank and no oil's coming up, you're probably not running enough oil in your gas mixture, and you should probably increase the amount of oil that you use. You should have some migrating oil, like what you see spinning up there. And this one looks like it was pretty good. So that's important. When you start your bike up cold, or let's say you've been putting around for a long time, just at low RPMs putting around, you finally decide to open up the throttle and now it's like breaking up, and you got to clean it out. You know the term of two strokes, you got to clean it out, where you just and then it finally takes off after it just kicks a huge puff of smoke out the rear, and then it finally jumps in the power band, takes off. That's because you're actually burning excessive migrating oil. At some point, if you ride around at low speeds or low RPMs, you will build up too much oil in the crank area, and then the first time you really wick it open, you get all that air and fuel, all that charge coming in, and the crank is now hauling ass. It's going to kick that stuff up into the transfer ports at a faster rate, which causes the breaking up and the excessive smoke coming out the rear end until it cleans that out. And that's why they call that cleaning it out. Now, why that's important to know is because everyone rides a bike a little bit differently. So you have some people that ride their bikes really slow. Like my wife's YZ125 here. When she first started riding, I had to lean this air-fuel ratio out. I originally started out at 32/1, which is Yamaha's recommendations for their two-strokes. And she kept fouling plugs. About every 5 hours or so, we'd have to put a new plug in it. I chased the jetting down. I couldn't go any leaner on the jetting, or it would be too lean. I came to the conclusion, we're just gonna have to run less oil in your bike. I brought her up to about what you would call 43/1, I guess, which is 3 ounces of oil per gallon. And she has, I don't even know if she's fouled a plug since, to be quite honest with you. Me, on the other hand, I keep my YZ125 pinned on a lot of these faster outdoor tracks. I keep it pinned for a long time. I use a lot of its power, and I'm just wringing it out. So I actually run more than what Yamaha suggests. Again, they suggest 32/1. I'm running about 25/1 on this one, which is about 5 ounces per gallon, because I'm staying full throttle a lot more, which means I am consistently keeping that migrating oil in the crank cleaned out, and so I have to replace it quicker so that the crank, the lower rod bearing, the crank bearings, and the piston still has a significant amount of oil. Where on my wife's bike, when she first started riding, she she hardly even ever got into the power band. She just torqued it around, and it was just building up too much migration oil. And then when she finally would start creeping in the power band, all that oil would come up at one time up to the spark plug, and that's what fouls them out. So as I just mentioned, Yamaha recommends 32/1 on pretty much all their two-stroke bikes. That's just a generic ratio they tell you to run. It's a good, safe ratio. If I remember correctly, KTM suggests either 50/1 or 60/1, and I think it depends on what bike you get. But it's pretty lean on the oil. They, from what I've been told, I don't know, but I've been told that they recommend that low ratio for emissions reasons, or emission tax reasons. But I don't know. I don't know. But I can tell you 50/1 and 60/1 is really lean on oil. When I first started wrenching on bikes for a living, I gained a lot of customers that were what I would call moto dads. A lot of the guys for the i4 MX series and stuff like that, where their kids were riding either 50, 65s, and 85cc, a lot of KTMs and Husqvarnas, and they were running that recommended 40 or 50 or 60/1. I think it was 50/1 is what most people were running at that time. And I kept replacing crankshafts for these guys and pistons. I mean, excessively. These bikes would only have, man, like less than 50 hours, and we were already doing crankshafts, and they were maybe getting 10 hours out of a piston, and the piston looked fried. And I was like, what oil ratio are you running? And found out most of the guys were running 50/1. Apparently what happened is one guy went around the track spurting out, you should run 50/1. Maybe his kid was the fast guy, and now every moto dad wants to copy the fast guy. They're all sitting there talking while their kids are out there racing. Next thing you know, everyone's running 50/1, and they're just flying through cranks and pistons. So the ones that were my customers, it took a couple times for some of them. They had to see me a couple times before they actually took my advice. I told them, at least run 32/1 on your kids' bikes. These little bikes, you're revving them out fast. At least run 32/1. And all the bikes that the dads took my suggestion, the crankshaft failures pretty much went down to almost none, and pistons started lasting longer. And of course, you can Google if you're interested. I know some people think you're going to gain power by running less oil. It's been dyno proven several times that up to the point of 20/1, they typically gain power as you run more oil. It's not a huge amount by any means. I'm talking, I think the difference from like 60 over 1 to 20 over 1 is about 1 horsepower on a 250cc, if I remember correctly. But it was enough to show us that running more oil is definitely not going to rob your horsepower. So fear not, you can run more oil. You're not going to slow your bike down. You'll make your wall a little bit lighter after a while because you will burn through more oil. But at the same time, your cranks are going to last longer, your piston's going to last longer, so that's all a good thing. And then when it comes to jetting, I've also heard people say that they could change their jetting just by changing their oil ratio. I've heard that for years. And I'm not saying that's not true. I can only tell you my experience. My experience is when I've taken bikes as much as 50 over 1 and brought them down to about 25 over 1, I have not seen any significant change in the jetting. Nothing that would cause me to change out the pilot or the main jet. I don't, and I'm real particular with my jetting. I know when a bike is running crisp and clean, and I haven't seen these type of changes when I change the oil ratio. So fear not, you can change your oil ratio. You can run more oil or less oil, and you're not going to have to become a jetting expert. It's not really going to significantly change your jetting, at least not a jet size by any means that I could tell. Of course, some of the theories behind that is not only are you have more oil mixed with the gas, and so now you're getting less gas for the amount of time of the fuel coming through that jet, but also that the oil can make the fuel thicker, which means it's harder to flow to the jet. But nowadays the oils are pretty thin. Maybe that was the case back in the old days with some of the castor-based oils that came out as thick as honey. Maybe, I don't know, maybe this is something that applied in the old days, but I'm just not seeing it nowadays. But let's just do a visual comparison real quick. 50 over 1 is what, 2.6 ounces? Yeah, fluid ounces, 2.6 ounces per gallon. So let's go ahead and, right there, let's go ahead and pop that in and let's see what that looks like. That right there is 50 over 1 for 1 gallon of gas. That's 2.6 ounces. You can see that's, you know how long it takes to burn a gallon of gas? It takes a little while. That's all the oil that crank and that piston is going to receive in the amount of time that you burn 1 gallon of gas. Now let's see what 32 to 1 looks like, which is 4 ounces per gallon. There you go, basically an ounce and a half more. There's 4 ounces per gallon, and that's, like I was mentioning, that's Yamaha's recommendation. But that's 4 ounces per gallon right there. And then I'll show you what I run, which is about 25 over 1, 5 ounces per gallon. And there's 5 ounces per gallon. So you can see that's a significant amount more than the 2.6 ounces per gallon. It's actually like twice as much. And you can find these ratio charts, by the way, all over the internet. Just Google that. So this is my suggestion of how much oil you should run on your bike, and just, you know, I would start with 32 over 1 if you don't know. Honestly, I wouldn't start with 50 over 1. I would start with a good, safe 32 over 1. I consider 32 over 1 like the perfect middle ground setting, which is 4 ounces per gallon. I consider that like a magic medium. It's probably one of the reasons why Yamaha suggests it. And the beauty of 32 over 1 is it's just 4 ounces per gallon. So let's say you're mixing up 3 gallons, you just put 12 ounces. You don't have to really sit there and do the math. Or should I say the math is not that difficult, because look at 40 over 1 here. 40 over 1 is 3.2 ounces per gallon. So now if you're going to run, if you're mixing up for 3 gallons, you're going to have to do the math. And you're going to be like, well, that's that's 9.6 ounces. That's why I run 43 over 1 on my wife's bike. I'm sorry if I mentioned 40 over 1 earlier on my wife's bike. It was actually 43 over 1, which is 3 ounces per gallon. I do that to keep it simple. I know it's just 3 ounces, so if I'm mixing up 3 gallons, it's just 9 ounces. So I personally try to keep it simple. I either run 5 ounces per gallon, which is about 25 over 1, or 4 ounces per gallon, which is about 32 over 1, or 3 ounces per gallon, which is about 43 over 1. Them are pretty much the only 3 ratios that I'm willing to run. I don't like going any leaner than 3 ounces per gallon on any 2-stroke, no matter how slow the rider is, because I have seen how much quicker the wear accumulates inside the motor when you get closer to 50 over 1. I just don't suggest running them that lean. Now that's me. I know there's going to be someone out there that says they use a fancy dancy synthetic high-end petroleum whatever oil, and the bottle says it's specially formulated to 60 over 1 and yada yada yada. But if you don't have migrating oil in there, then you're missing out. You need that volume. It doesn't matter how good the oil is. You also need a certain amount of volume. It helps with your ring sealing and stuff like that. So back to my suggestion. If you really don't know what you should run, start with 32/1, which is 4 ounces per gallon. Your motor's going to be safe there for the most. You could be a fast guy that really should be at like 25/1 or 20/1, or you could be a slow guy that should be about 40 or 43/1, but 32/1 is a good, safe, happy medium. Start there if you don't know. Now, if you're on a smaller bike, like if your kid's running a 50cc or 65cc and they're ringing the crap out of it, the smaller bikes rev higher. So a higher revving bike is going to be spinning the crank faster, which means less chance of a good migration of oil to build up. So it is a combination of motor size and rider ability, as well as conditions. Conditions being, you know, if you ride a track where you can hold it pinned a lot. If your kid's holding it pinned a lot and he's ringing it out, he's on a small bike, you're going to want to run probably a little more than 32/1. You're probably going to want to bring her up to about 25/1 to save your cranks and pistons and everything like that. But if your kid starts fouling a plug, bring him to 32/1. If he's still, and the jetting's good and he's still fouling plugs, maybe take him to 43/1, which is 3 ounces per gallon. That's my suggestion on that. And if you're running a big bore, let's say you got a 500cc, you know, and you're just torquing around, well, you probably totally fine running 43/1, even if you're a faster guy, because you're keeping the RPMs down, so the migrating oil is hanging around longer inside the crank area. So if you're fouling plugs and your jetting is pretty good, just run less oil. If you're not fouling plugs and your jetting's good, but you're ringing it out a lot, run more oil. You'll get longer life out of your piston and your crank, and hey, you might be able to unleash a tad bit of horsepower. Now, I have heard some people say that fouling plugs has nothing to do with the oil ratio. It has more to do with the jetting. In my experience, it has to do with both. This bike right here is probably the biggest proof that I have right now in front of me, where all I really did was just lean her down to 43/1, I mean, and she stopped fouling plugs. The bike I never changed any of the jetting. It was already jetted and perfect. All I did was change the oil ratio and the plug fouling stopped. So it is a combination of proper jetting and the proper oil ratio for your rider. How fast he's riding, how much he's ringing it out, and also the motor size. Is it a big bore? Or is it a little 50cc that's always being rung out on the rev limiter? Alright, well, so now we're on to what type of two-cycle oil you should use. Well, I'm going to first suggest always use something that's made for our high-end racing dirt bikes. Don't go buy the weed eater stuff. It's just not really meant for that type of abuse like this. Look, high RPM, synthetic. But I would also suggest sticking with more of your synthetic blend ones instead of going with your castor-based ones. Like, I love 927, don't get me wrong. Castor 927 is some of the best smelling stuff out there, bottom line. And I know Mitch Payton still suggests it on pretty much all their two-stroke race bikes. It's a castor-based oil. I used it years ago, but here are my complaints about it. My first complaint is it builds up in the power valve area. You can see how these are clean, both these cylinders. That's from my wife's bike. This is from mine. I haven't cleaned this one out, but this one I cleaned out with some brake cleaner or whatever. But you can see that there's no crud in here. There's a crud that 927 leaves behind, and it's like almost impossible to get. I mean, you really got to scrape it off, and it builds up quick too. And another issue with your castor base oils, not only them but Golden Spectrum and some of your other ones, is it builds up in the exhaust pipe, your expansion chamber. Any two-cycle oil is going to build up an expansion chamber at some point. This was used only synthetic. You can see it's starting to build up. This was just your Maxima K2, but it was just starting to build up. But Castor 927 builds up a lot and thick, and it can. I have seen it literally, like on older bikes, like just decrease the size of the exhaust pipe port. And another thing too is when that stuff builds up in your exhaust pipe, well, you lose resonance inside the pipe. These pipes are hollow in there, and they are supposed to reflect, have a reflecting aspect to them, that to build the resonance will cause like a harmonic reflection in there down here at the stinger. I'm not explaining this very well, but long story short, the tinier your pipe is, the better the bike's going to perform. That's why when you put a new pipe on, it has that ding, 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 ding. It just has that really crisp, clean sound. That's because the pipe's all nice and clean. And when they get older, they start sounding like rah, 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 rah. That's because this has now built up a lot of carbon inside the pipe, and it dampens down the effect of the pipe. And actually, the horsepower of the bike will actually start to go down. So the cleaner your pipe is, the better the pipe's going to perform. So when I consider the power valve and I consider the pipe, I can't be using caster base oils. Not for me. I like my pipes to perform good for a long time, and I don't want to completely have to scrape the power valve every time I do a top end. As you can see, all I typically have to do is just spray some brake cleaner and it comes out clean. Why? Because these are clean burning oils that also have detergents in them to keep them from sticking to parts, and it keeps your power valve clean. The 4 oils that I can honestly suggest that will achieve what I just mentioned, keep the power valve clean, protecting your motor pretty well, and also keeping the pipe fairly clean, it's going to be your Maxima Formula K2, AMSOIL Dominator, Motul 800, and Yamalube 2R. It's a little bit cheaper than the other ones, and if you're on a budget, this is a really good 2-cycle oil. Them are just 4 off the top of my head. I know there's also other really good 2-cycle oils out there. I'll just give you 4 examples that are readily available that I know from experience are good 2-cycle oils. And as I mentioned, Mitch Payton, he suggests Castle 927 when you have a race bike built from him. You got to keep in mind that, you know, he's dealing with bikes that, I mean, they sell pipes. That's what he does. He's pro circuit. He sells pipes for a living. They're flying to these motors. They need the very most maximum protection, and I think that's what this provides, but it comes at a cost. It will build up in your pipes and in your power valve pretty quickly, and that's the cost that you pay if you run this stuff. For us, every weekend riders or whatever, we like to get the most for our money. We don't want to be gunking up our pipes or spending hours in the garage cleaning our power valves. Your synthetic based 2-cycle oils are just fine. And look, it's made for high RPM. Oh, one quick tip: when you're not riding your bike and it's parked during the week, just shut off your gas. I've seen people where they've let their bike sit for 2 or 3 months with the gas on, and now the bike won't start. What happens is the gas goes into the carburetor here. The carburetor is vented, the float bowl and the carburetor is vented, so the gas eventually evaporates, but it leaves the oil behind. The oil doesn't evaporate like the gas does. So now more gas comes in here because the float level dropped, and that gas evaporates and it leaves that oil behind. Before you know it, you have a float bowl with nothing but oil in it, and then you have to drain the oil out the bottom of the float bowl before the bike will start up. So just shut your gas off when your bike's sitting. Well, I think that's all I got for you guys today. I hope I'm not missing out on anything here. Again, this ain't the gospel. This is just my experience. Some of the stuff some people might disagree with or might agree with. I don't know, but these are just my experiences. I thought I'd cover this first before I start diving into the carburetors. Here shortly, I'm going to dig into these carburetors and kind of give you guys a tutorial on how to jet these 2-stroke carburetors out, so stay tuned for that. If you're not subscribed, it's free. All you got to do is click the subscribe button down there, and I appreciate all my subscribers, and I hope you guys have a great weekend of riding. Catch you guys next time.